Hello explorers! Hello explorers! Hello explorers! Either has something to do with gravity. Hot water vents.
In the spring of 1956 or 57, I was on leave from national service. I was spending my 4 leaves of freedom at home in Alderney. I was at something of a loss, and I hung around the new harbour. It was new in 1830. This was a picturesque location where the coming and going of boats and the mysterious activities of fishermen fascinated me. Out of plain curiosity, I decided to go for a sea trip on board a fishing boat. I had been advised that the Kinney brothers were the most competent practitioners of this black art, fishing. One morning, very early, I approached them as they were loading their boat with crab pots and bait. Would they allow me to go out with them so as to learn something about this work? They apologised, but they were too busy, and moreover at their busiest time of the year, last season, they had taken out a young visitor on their boat, but he had fallen seriously ill, and they had to leave their pots and return to port at top speed. They couldn't risk another such loss of money again. However, very kindly, they pointed out to me an old retired fisherman who used to go out from time to time just for pleasure. I introduced myself to this ancient and made the same request. He was a skinny little old chap. He appeared so frail that a puff of wind I thought could have blown him away, but when I shook his hand, his grasp had the grip of an eagle's claw. He was called Colonel, but not because of any military connection. Having spent a dissipated youth chasing women and getting drunk, the Salvation Army had converted him, and he had become a pillar of morality and teetotal. His previous fellows in sin had given him this snide nickname out of revenge. He was dressed in an old blue guernsey and trousers, both patched and shiny with wear and fish scales. He chewed tobacco, a custom I thought had dated back to the age of big square riggers. He gave me a cautious, penetrating look. No doubt what he saw was a young twerp with more muscle than sense. Nevertheless, he spat a jet of brown liquid over the gunwale of Hirondelle and nodded his head. I could go out with him on approval. That day we went out to the boo, a patois term for the sunken reef, which is called in English the ledge. That afternoon I returned home with 2 plump pollock. The next day was Sunday, a day of rest strictly observed by the faithful. The Colonel invited me to report to his house at 6 o'clock Monday morning. He was waiting for me by his car, an old jalopy of an Austin 7 with spindly wheels. On the back seat were 3 pots and a box of rotting horse mackerel that was to be bait. The stink was impressive. The Colonel explained that in order to economise in petrol, we were going to coast down the road to the port, but first I would have to push the car to get it moving. Once it was going, I would have to jump in. On the return journey, the starting handle had to be turned at least 10 times to get the engine going. To tell the truth, it was quicker for me to walk up the hill, while the old banger laboured away noisily in a cloud of smoke. Usually the Colonel would catch a tow from a passing farmer on his tractor in exchange for a crab or a lobster. On the 3rd day, after a morning's fishing, we returned to port at low water. We had to wait for the flood tide to get us to our mooring in the new harbour. I was given the order, drop anchor, which I did. but the anchor was not tied to its warp. A truly useless beginner. I expected a real bawling out and a stream of invective, but the Colonel simply said, "It was my fault, you weren't to know." An hour was spent afterwards calmly dredging with a killick to retrieve the anchor. After all, it was too valuable to lose. Never afterwards did he reproach me jeeringly for my idiocy. He was a real gent. During the 3 following weeks, I received a basic training in seamanship and coastal navigation. I remember particularly one day when we were 5 or 6 miles offshore. A thick fog had clamped down. Visibility was reduced to 50 metres or less. But there was no panic. The Colonel got out an old gimbaled compass in a box out of the cuddy up forward and placed it on the deck in front of me. "Steer northeast by northeast." After what seemed like 30 minutes motoring, shrouded in dense cotton wool, I noticed a strange upwelling in the sea on our port bow. "That's the tip of the Bruntai Reef. Change course to northwest by west." Another 15 minutes, and there, dead ahead, were breakers. "That's okay. Set course for southwest." 20 minutes later, the end of the breakwater loomed up out of the fog. For the Colonel and his colleagues, this sort of pilotage was run-of-the-mill. To a landsman, it seemed like magic. The Colonel taught me that navigation is a 3-dimensional science, for a knowledge of the contours of the seabed is as important as compass bearings or an awareness of tidal streams. I get annoyed when I hear educated people talking condescendingly of horny-handed sons of toil, for the work of a fisherman or a farmer demands a knowledge and an intelligence as keen as that used in intellectual professions, without counting the courage and the endurance needed. 4 weeks aboard the Hirondelle changed the course of my life. 2 years later I became a professional yachtsman. Not a real seaman perhaps, but much better than being a pen pusher in the city.